Can you imagine finding out that a Chinese state-sponsored hacker group spent over a year inside your network and your MFA didn't do a single thing? That's exactly what happened to some academic and medical research institutions, and why phishing-resistant MFA isn't optional anymore. Today, Prasanna and I break down exactly how attackers harvested credentials, hijacked REDCap, which is a thing for research and education, Google Workspace with fake compliant rules, and exfiltrated sensitive research data for months without anybody noticing. We'll also talk about what you need to do right now so that this doesn't happen to you. Here we turn admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the Backup Wrap-Up. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston. I have with me a guy who is super jealous of the fact that in the last couple of weeks, I have used, I think, every tool that I own. Isn't that true, Prasanna?
Including the one that I had you buy.
That is true. A significant amount of use of the one that you basically really talked me into. And I was like, what do I need one of those for? And then I
found you the deal.
What?
I found you the deal.
You did find me a deal. Of course, that the tool we're talking about at this moment is the planer. And if you've never had a planer, it's an amazing device, but if you've never used one before, you don't know why you would want one.
Until you use it and then you're like, oh my gosh.
You're like, how did I ever live my life without this? It's like the air fryer. It's like the air fryer of tools.
I don't know about an air fryer.
Meaning you don't know if an air fryer is awesome?
Or if I would justify having an air fryer.
That's because you've never had an air fryer. See, this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That, and you know what else? The West Wing.
Oh.
If you would just watch the West Wing. So here's another interesting thing about Prasanna. Prasanna owns, because you got a deal on Apple, like Apple, what is that?
Apple TV?
Plus?
Yeah.
Apple TV. And you bought the entire series for some ridiculous price, right? Like, how much was it? It
was like $30 or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was like a year ago, at least?
Well, it might be going on a year and a half now.
Yeah. And you've yet to see a single episode. Because you know that the moment you do, you're going to get hooked and you're going to...
But here's my problem, though, Curtis, is this is not atypical for me, where I will buy something and it will sit there for years and years.
This is something you and I share.
Yes. Like so recently I've gotten back into watching physical media, right? Blu-rays and all the rest.
Yeah.
I had some which were still sealed for the last 15 years that have never been opened.
Wow. Yeah. That was kind of like me in the wood shop with some of my dust collection. And now that's my new obsession, is my dust collection. Yeah. Anyway, people they want to hear about this. They want to hear about Google.
Are you sure?
Yeah. So this is another one of those stories where you're like, man, like, because it's another living off the land attack where...
What's living off the land for our listeners?
Yeah. So basically, living off the land is an attack that leverages the tools that you have in your arsenal against you, basically, right? And what happened here, and so first off, who are we talking about? They're a threat intelligence group. They have published a really big report, which we'll link in the show notes, that really detailed. I have to give them props that they really detailed what happened here. It's actually a Chinese PRC sponsored threat actor called UNC 6508. That is the worst name ever.
So sometimes they have these titles, I don't know, labels for some of these attacks. But then the same organization, like what we might know externally as Lockbit, or we'll take whatever you're...
Yeah. What's the name?
It's like multiple ones.
Yeah. What's the name of the one that did the last attack that we covered?
Shiny Hunters?
It was the Canvas.
No.
So we didn't cover it. I'm sorry. It was the last attack you and I talked about.
Yes.
And it was the attack of Canvas, which is a learning platform. And because I saw an article that said it was the same group. I didn't check that, but Google is calling them UNC 6508. And they targeted mainly North American institutions, academic, medical, things like that. And via this tool called REDCap, which is a research electronic data capture, it's a web-based platform, and which has a unique attribute that allows you to run multiple versions of the software simultaneously. And so even though you may be upgrading and patching more recent versions of the software, if there's an exploit against an older version of the software, they would be able to do it. And that's what happened here. And once again, it started with harvested credentials. We don't know
Whose credentials do they get?
It was an admin. It was an admin's credentials. But again, they broke some of the rules. And we're going to talk, meaning the victims. They broke some of the rules that we talk about, and we're going to cover them that had they not done that, it would have been the attack would have been different. But the scary thing about this is that they put in this malware that's called Infinite.red. It sounds to me like it's a specific malware that they wrote just for REDCap. And it sat there for how long, Prasanna?
It looks like, from what I could tell, this happened like November 2023.
Yeah, it looks like literally they got in, and then we talk about dwell time. We talk about, just to go back to backups here for a minute, one of the real problems with these types of attacks is that sometimes having a really good backup isn't going to be enough, because if they've been in there for over a year, like a year and a half, maybe even
The
more?
retention probably isn't that far back.
No, right? You're
Yeah.
not gonna have backups that don't have this. And what they did was they leveraged these, what do you call it, vulnerable versions of REDCap to harvest the credentials. And then they
But wait.
somehow, but wait, go ahead.
But even when they harvest the credentials, it's not like they wrote it to a file. They wrote it back to a REDCap database,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The in-product database. It's not
Yeah.
like they wrote it to some
Talk
other
about
files,
living
right?
off the land, right? And then they intercepted REDCap's upgrade process. So it then injected this malware into every new version, right? Even if you were trying to patch things, you would get the new version, right?
It's an interesting question. I know we talk about patching and making sure everything's up to date and having central IT. Do you think a lot of these issues stem from the fact that these were like IT or software packages targeted at academia and researchers who sometimes pull things together on their own? It reminds me of like a shadow IT phenomenon, right? Where
No,
they're not
no,
necessarily
actually,
always.
yeah, I don't think so. From what I'm seeing, is that, again, we're going to get to the what could they have done better and what you can do better. I think just it's not the upgrade process. It goes back to the harvested credentials. It
Yeah.
goes back to limiting the ability for products to do what they did. And then we're going to get to the next thing, which is, once they had been harvesting credentials for a year, right? For over a year, right? And then they took some of those credentials and they tried to log into other systems. And this is where Google Workspace comes in. And so what they had was, once they were able to take those harvested credentials. They started with stolen credentials, then they used those credentials to harvest other credentials. Then they took those credentials and they logged into Google Workspace.
Yep.
Into, again,
As a domain
valid
admin.
admin as a domain admin, and they created something called compliance rules. You want to talk about what those are?
Yeah. So in an organization, you might have certain compliance requirements, which are, hey, if an email is from this person or to this person, or if it contains these types of words, then forward it off somewhere else so then it can be secured and can't be deleted and is protected for compliance, auditing, other purposes. And so they created a compliance rule that said if it matched certain keywords,
Yeah.
to send it out to a certain email address. And This was ingenious because it just looked like normal email traffic. So even if you
Right.
were trying to detect something, it was like, oh, yeah, this is just part of your normal systems, operations, and all the rest of that. And so
Yeah.
this email address was controlled by the attackers.
And they would, and then it would BCC forward to a Gmail address that
Yeah.
they owned, right? The keywords, very interesting. The keywords, they're talking about geostrategic policy, military strategy, advanced tech, and specific pathogens. And by the way, that one was interesting because one pathogen that they had on the list was chikungunya.
Chikungunya.
You can say that? Okay.
Yeah,
I've
chikungunya.
never heard of that before. So they're saying it's a mosquito-borne viral disease that's responsible
Common
for
in
an outbreak
Southeast
in
Asian.
China. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Common in
interesting,
India
right?
too.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Mm.
Hence your ability to pronounce that word. I've never even heard of that word before. Anyway, so they were, so on one hand, you're saying it just looks like normal email traffic, but I do think that perhaps somebody could have noticed. By the way, the compliance rule they created was called Patriot, which is interesting, right?
Didn't they
Um,
misspell it?
you're right. So they did. So it's spelled Patriot, which again might have been a red flag, right? But and so that basically anything that met the filters that they were looking for gets forwarded to the bad guys. And the Google Threat Intelligence Group, is that what it's called?
Yeah, GTIG.
Yeah, GTIG. It says they disrupted the infrastructure, they disabled the Gmail account that was being used for exfiltration, and they notified everybody and published rules on how to stop this. But I always go back to what could they have done differently, right? And I don't want to focus on just this particular account, but I don't think REDCap is alone in this idea of having legacy versions being run side by side. Can you think of any other products that work like that?
VMware.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Right? Because when you're describing REDCap,
yeah,
I was like, that sounds exactly like a hypervisor.
yeah. You're right. And
Is that what
and
you were thinking?
so
Or you give something else?
no, no, I wasn't thinking.
Oh,
My brain was blank. But yeah, no, I think that's a perfect example, right? Where you leave many versions running. And so really what they could have done in this case is, again, obviously, general password. We can start with general password hygiene, right? That if they had been doing normal password hygiene, the passwords wouldn't have been harvested out there somewhere in the wild. And then because the initial attack started with passwords that have been harvested out somewhere, they don't know where that happened. And if that means that somebody was using a username and password externally, potentially that then was used internally. So if they had good password hygiene, that wouldn't have happened. The next thing is to not
wait,
go ahead.
I'm surprised you didn't start with the number 0. What's the first thing that you do before password? In your list of 3 things, if you did these 3 things, you
Oh,
would prevent.
patching? You're talking about?
Yes. And so for patching, I was gonna say inventory management
Yeah,
because you had
absolutely.
and you knew what was out there, and then you were able to patch it. You probably you may have avoided some of these issues.
Yeah. And then the big thing with the legacy version support is to not do, right? You don't run things that you don't, at a minimum, you disable them. The best practice is actually to remove the old version completely. Don't leave it sitting around. So another thing is to not trust application level authentication by itself, to use something like SSO. This is an important enough thing that you don't trust the IAM system of just any old piece of software, that you use SSO to log into important things like REDCap. And
Can I
had they done that, and by the way, this had, when we go back to we talked about the Canvas hack, same thing there, that I'm currently talking with a client that they were hit by the Canvas hack, but it was very minor because they use SSO for the
mm,
vast majority of accounts when logging into it.
one other thing, and I don't know if we've necessarily touched on it in past episodes, by using SSO or a central identity provider,
Mhm.
you can enforce requirements. So if a password needs to be rotated, do you use MFA, minimum number of characters, all the rest of these things you can enforce versus if REDCap had their own password system and say didn't have this functionality, you're kind of limited. Maybe someone hasn't changed their password in 7 years. Who knows?
Yeah,
But
or even if it had that functionality, that means you're managing that functionality in every SaaS app that you use, right?
yep.
Yeah,
And
good point.
if you're an organization, you really should have a central password system,
Yes.
authentication system.
There's an entire industry built around that. Thumbs up to that. The next
I touched on
one,
something.
go ahead. What?
I touched on something which I think might be the next one.
Okay. Touch
Is the
away.
next one MFA? Is it MFA? It's
The
always
next,
MFA.
the next,
It's like
well,
it's always DNS.
specifically phishing-resistant MFA. Yes. You want to talk about what that is?
Yeah. So, like we've talked about, someone can guess your password or steal your password, like what happened here. But with MFA or multi factor authentication, just having the password isn't enough. It should also send you a way to authenticate in addition to just knowing the password, the username and password. Typically, you see this as a code that shows up on your phone. Email is not great, SMS is not great, but it's better than nothing. But you
Right.
really should be using like a one time password that's
Yes.
out there. Many versions are out there. So that helps. And then the other thing that you mentioned, Curtis, is phishing resistant, right? So you want to make sure that someone doesn't go and steal your MFA token and then start to use it. That you do have, I know we've talked about this in past episodes. There's this notion of MFA fatigue, right? Where people constantly keep pinging you, being like, is this you? Is this you? And then you click yes because you're tired of saying no and responding all the time.
Well,
So you want
well, I
something
think
that is resilient to those.
I think the big thing with truly phishing-resistant MFA is that MFA that is tied to something, right? It's tied to a security key. It's tied to a particular location. It's tied to a particular device, so that even if, again, just like it's for the MFA, right?
Yep.
That if they steal a session cookie, which is what was happening here, they were stealing session cookies, then they wouldn't be able to just replay that because the system
You can
would
factor
notice
it.
that it was coming from
Yeah.
other place. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can and should investigate passkeys, right? And again, the beautiful thing about passkeys is that it solves all of this, and they're tied to a location, right?
What's a passkey?
Um, Thank you. So a passkey is basically a complete replacement for passwords, and it's basically think of it as a locally stored, I was going to say password, but it is a key that is stored locally with the device that you have, that is tied to that device and tied to that account, and it's basically played on your behalf whenever you need to log into that account. So passkeys fall under what's called FIDO, which is fast identity online, and the common thing that is stated, there are many known attacks for passwords in MFA, and you touched on one of them, which is the concept of becoming an MFA fatigue attack, where they send you so many things that you accept one of them, right? And then they take the accepted one and then they go do bad things, right? There are no known attacks against FIDO-compliant passkeys. So if you're not doing them everywhere you believe you can be doing them, you should be investigating that right now. If you're familiar with that and you're working your way, I would just say prioritize that wherever you can. If you don't know anything about it, then you should be looking into passkeys. One of the things that GTIG pushed in terms of what could have helped here is the concept of device-bound session credentials and context-aware access. And we talked about this a little bit. Context-aware access, if you enable that on an account, it's going to do things like, why is this coming from a different place than it was 30 seconds ago, right? And why is it coming from this IP address? Why is it coming from this country? I thought this person was in California. Whatever, it's a context, right? And every time you go to access, it's going to check that context. And then you have the device-bound session credentials, or DBSC. And what they do is they're tying each, because when you authenticate with a browser, that creates a session. And if you're using DBSC, those credentials only work in that session and they tie it to that device. It's a little bit like passkeys in that regard. And Google is just talking about these, especially for highly sensitive accounts. If you turn on these two features it would tie, once you authenticate, it would tie that authentication to that session, and then context-aware access would check that so the two work together hand in hand. And what that meant was if and when someone like this malware steals your session credentials, they wouldn't be able to use those anywhere else.
Yeah. And specifically, this is the case where they're not just stealing your password, but they're actually
Right,
stealing, say, your browser cookie,
right,
your cookie, and trying to replay and reuse your cookie on a different device. And
right.
by using device-bound session credentials, you're guaranteed that even if they stole that session cookie, it's not going to be usable anywhere else.
Again, it's specifically something that they talked about, or that Google talked about. So the next is this idea of compliance rules, and they're not, that's what Google Workspace calls it. Every system has something like
Mhm.
this, and the idea is look at any standing rules that are there. And a large company, you may have tons of them. This is where I think AI can be helpful here. Look for things that are created that are forwarding email out to especially external accounts, right?
Didn't you
Because that's
also have an
what's
alert anytime something gets touched in these compliance rules?
yeah, agreed, right? Have a compliance rule versus compliance rule. That anything that's a new compliance rule, it should trigger some sort of event so that you can then go check that. That's a great point.
So then the next one they recommend is something you might think is obvious, but I guess a lot of people get this incorrect. It's separating your credentials across security domains. So as we looked at this case, REDCap, one security domain, Google Workspace, another security domain. The two streams shall never cross. And yet someone used the same credentials across the two. And that's what sort of allowed a breach of REDCap to now impact their Google Workspace account. And
Right.
so you really should be keeping credentials separate if they don't need to be common, or using SSO or an identity provider which deals with all of this for you so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, or also
Would you
PAM, so privileged access management, right? And go ahead.
Here's a question for you, Curtis.
Yeah.
I know this comes up a lot of times when we talked about backup systems, how keep backup systems separate than your production systems from a credential management, Active Directory perspective. When a company is using SSO,
Mhm.
say Okta or someone else like that, do you think it is important to still think about these security domains and so have a different SSO user for REDCap versus for their Google Workspace account? Or is that overkill since you have Okta providing some of that control?
What yeah, when it comes to admin accounts, I don't think there is such a thing as overkill, right? I think you need to treat admin accounts differently. Perhaps you do one thing for regular users. And again, going back to the client that I was talking about, that the reason why they use SSO for all the normal users, but admin accounts were separate. So I
Mm.
think that is important. You can use SSO to layer on top of that, right? So that they work together. But I still think you need to keep that separate for all the reasons that we just talked about. And then the next thing we talk about here is get some logging, man. Some sort of XDR, some sort of SIEM, some sort of monitoring going on, looking for the kind of things that were happening here because they had to be sending a butt ton of sensitive email out to external accounts for a really long time, and nobody seemed to catch it. I don't that's quite disconcerting.
Did they say when they actually breached Google Workspace? Because I know
It was towards the end. It was towards the end of
okay,
the attack. Yeah. It was the last thing they did after they'd been harvesting credentials for over a year.
yeah,
Yeah.
crazy.
Crazy.
So here's a question. So we talked about this, right, and things you could do to prevent attacks. Given the name of the podcast, is there anything that you would
Did we
think
forget something?
from a data protection, data recovery perspective, from a cyber recovery perspective, they could have, should have done? Or is this, even if you had the most amazing disaster cyber recovery plan in place if you didn't do any of these basics, your host?
I don't think this is one of the situations where I'm not sure how much backups would have actually helped, right? Because you do need, obviously, you're never going to be saying you don't need backups, right? One of the things we talk a lot about is just please, for the love of everything, please make sure that you have regular automated backups of everything that are on a separate security domain and also that use truly immutable backups, right? That you, because the worst thing is when you hear something like this and then you see that the backups were also impacted. The downside here is that backups quite possibly aren't going to help you because the two things. One is many people don't store their backups longer than the amount of time that this attack took. Number one. Number two, what are you going to recover? Are you going to literally, like you found out that they first compromised your system a year and a half ago? Are you going to restore your database to a year and a half ago? You're not going to do that. So the related topic here is from a system standpoint, one of the things that we came to in the book, which we haven't mentioned in the book, if you're not familiar with the book, that should be over my right shoulder in
Left.
your view. If you're watching this, it's my left shoulder, but it's right in the video, right? I think I'm pointing right. Yeah, it's to my right in the video. Anyway, the is Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery, which I wrote with Dr. Mike Saylor, who is a frequent podcast guest. That, dang it, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about the backup. So you really have to approach backup as two things. We really came to the reality that there were three ways to restore after something like this. One is to just restore back to a point in time before you know that you were attacked. And that's like the last thing we want you to do, actually, in terms of restoring the operating system and the applications, because it's really hard to know when that point is, and it's really easy to reinfect your systems. So that's one method. The other is this idea of restore and then go in and surgically clean each system before you release it to the public, right? And that is better than just knowingly restoring without doing any cleaning. But again, it still can be really difficult to find some of this very pesky malware. You talk about the malware here that kept reinfecting. Sometimes the malware will be in the firmware and it will reinfect you after a reboot. So really, I think the only real method here I guess it's technically backups, but it's really an automated, like infrastructure as code type environment where you know when we talk about VMs and applications, you know what version of the OS you're running, you know what version of the app you're running. You should be able to push a button and boom, you have a new VM of that from a trusted source that was created when you first made that system. This isn't something you're backing up. So what you're backing up is the application data, the database, and the documents and all of that stuff. And then when it's time to rebuild, you rebuild the OS and the application, and then you restore the actual data for that application.
I have a question.
Generally speaking, the data itself won't be infected. Go ahead.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you know, and maybe this is also a Dr. Mike question, any ransomware actors who have attacked the golden images?
I am not aware of any, right? I think I would argue, you mean the actual where the images are stored?
In the sense of if they infected the golden image, right? Like you said in your case, right?
Like a
Your
supply
pristine
side type attack, basically. Yeah.
Right. Or during the attack, yeah. If they infected those images as you're trying to recover and rebuild, like you said, right? Rebuild the OS and everything else, you're basically reinfecting yourself. Now, hopefully people are testing those as well before they actually deploy them during rebuild, but maybe that's something important to think about.
It's a good risk to think about. And I guess in my mind, any golden image is stored either on worm media or on immutable, like worm media, like a DVD type situation, or on truly immutable storage. But because again, you got to think of it like a backup. You got to make sure that there's no way they can attack it, right?
And I
so
do
this
wonder
is
how
something
many
that you're
people
creating
actually,
right in the very beginning.
yeah.
Go
And
ahead.
I do wonder how many people actually think about that, because
I
I
don't
didn't
think
think
they
about
do.
that until you were actually just talking through it. And I was like,
Yeah.
huh.
Yeah. You have to think about it like a backup, and that backup has to
Yeah.
be stored in a way that no one can ever get to it. And again, my standard there is if you can't delete it, even if you want to, then I'm happy. If it's anything less than that, I'm not so happy. And there are a bunch of ways to do that, right? There are truly immutable storage platforms that even you can't delete. There's different modes. Sometimes you'll see compliance mode and retention mode. You want the more restrictive of the two. Again, the standard is if you can't delete it, even if you want to, then that's what you want, right? And you can also do
Caveat
that
taking a
with worm
sledgehammer to
tape,
it.
and you can do it with worm optical media,
Yeah.
one of which we'd covered here. MDesk, right? The media that's meant to be around forever. I want to see hackers attack that. Good luck with that.
It's called a blowtorch. Which is what I was saying. Unless, like, the only way you can destroy this media is, like you said, if you have physical access, all bets are off.
Yeah, that's true with any
Yeah.
element of cybersecurity, right?
Yep.
So that's why physical access is paramount. And I go back to the best that I've ever seen there, where it took multiple layers to get in the building. I remember I did this a couple of years ago with a client where it took a half hour just to get in the building. And then once you were in the building, you were monitored because physical access is king, right? Thanks again for chatting about one of my favorite topics.
I know. I love these topics. Come on.
I was talking about woodworking.
Oh. I'm glad to see at least you're using the tool which I guilt tripped you into buying, so I feel less bad.
It was a lot of fun. I made, for a preschool that I work with, I made these plexiglass windows. I made window frames out
They're
of 2
very
by 3s.
large. Yeah.
They were 2x4 plexiglass window frames. I made 7 of them, and they were incredibly inexpensive because I did them with all of my own tools. And it was very cool. All right, folks, thanks for listening. If you didn't listen, why would we even do this? That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.